continue to provide a forum for our community of counsellors, researchers, those that work in regulatory and policy space, and any other areas that are involved in how COVID-19 is impacting gambling behaviour. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, many lands in this case, in a virtual space, but in my case and the university's, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and as we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kerrie Macalister. I am a clinician at the University of Sydney's Gambling Treatment Clinic. And I thought I'd just kick off by sharing some of my experiences of COVID and the impact on gambling for some of the clients I'm seeing in the clinic. The first thing I'll say is we were really fortunate to be able to transition to online sessions. I think we'd started and kicked off early April. And I think that was really, a great thing for us. I was really happy to be able to connect with clients and provide that support. My initial reluctance and some of my colleagues' initial reluctance has been really soothed because it's actually been quite seamless in that transition. I think I'm a bit of an old traditionalist and I do prefer face-to-face. I'm sure there'll be a lot of nods if I could see all your heads. But it certainly has been a really good alternative to providing support, and in some cases preferable is from some of the clients I've seen. There is a lot of anticipation I'm hearing around what's going to happen when venues open, obviously from our land-based gambling clients, but I guess time will tell. And also perhaps what might come out of the online gambling space. And that's certainly not what I'm seeing with my clients, but perhaps in intakes in the coming months. Just a quick overview of the format for today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our three panellists and hand over to each of them to discuss our topic for today. There are a couple of journal articles that were attached to the initial invite, so they'll be covered. But as it is, the call is set up such that everyone is on mute, apart from myself and the three speakers, and I believe video also turned off. If you find you have a question during the speakers, could you please utilise the Zoom chat function, which appears at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who haven't used it, if you click on that little dialogue box that says chat, and I think we've even got some on there already. I can see a little, oh no, that's okay. If you click on that, basically you will be able to type a message in the chat box. You can also direct that message to particular people. And in this case, I'll ask, if you do have a question, could you please direct it to myself, Kerrie Macalister? If you're worried about the spelling, you'll see it underneath my little video shot. And then I'm going to collate questions for us to talk and discuss at the end of at the end of all the speakers. So yeah, we've got, I think, there were over 80 participants registered. I'm not sure how many we have on the call, but we'll do our best to answer those questions. But please be patient with us. It might not, if your question doesn't get covered, we'll do our best to get to them, but we may not. Without further ado, let me turn to introducing the panel. We have three speakers today. I've been fortunate to know all three speakers. So apart from introducing their quals, I might add a bit of a flavour of what I know about these three amazing people that we have here to discuss the impact of COVID on gambling behaviour. They don't look nervous. I thought they might look nervous when I said that. Now there's a giggle from Chris, so he's nervous. Chris Hunt is our first speaker for today. He is a clinical psychologist who is a senior supervisor at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney. Dr. Hunt has been working in the clinic for 12 years and has experience with a range of different psychological therapies for problem gambling. And today, Chris is going to take us through the research on how recessions have impacted gambling behaviour. So he's going to look to be talking a little about past. We've got a bit of a theme running through with Tom talking about some present, and perhaps Sally talking a little bit about future impacts. But what I want to share about Chris is that during isolation, he's been torturing me with his brilliant cooking. He's an amazing chef, and I get pictures of his seafood spreads as I'm eating my bangers and mash with the kids, and I try not to dislike him too much when he does it. But yeah, for those of you who are into your master chefs, pick his brain. He's really, really good at it. Our second speaker is Tom Swanton. He's a PhD candidate and research assistant at our university clinic. Tom's research examines the link between gambling and consumer finance and includes issues relating to credit use, debt problems, and payments. Tom has been working on research examining the impact of COVID-19 on gambling behaviour, exactly what we're here to talk about today. And whilst the research is in progress, Tom's going to be able to give us some ideas of how that's going, and hopefully in future journal clubs be able to report back some of those findings. And the thing I want to share about Tom is I've been very fortunate to work with him in a couple of settings, and I challenge anyone who's met him to dislike him. He's one of the brightest and kindest people I've met in my working experience. So I throw the gauntlet out. Finally, our last speaker is Dr. Sally Gainsbury. She's the co-director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic in the Brain Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. She's also the editor of International Gambling Studies and serves on the editorial boards of the Psychology of Addictive Behaviour and Gaming Law Review. Dr. Gainsbury's research focuses on understanding the psychology of gambling, particularly relating to emerging technologies, including gaming. And today, Sally's going to be talking about some of the possible future trends that may come out of the impact of COVID on gambling behaviour. And what I want to share about Sally is she is one of the hardest working people I think I've ever met in a couple of professions that I've had, and I just am yet to determine if she has an off button. And those of you who know her, I hope, are nodding furiously at this point in time. But without further ado, I just want to hand over to Chris, who's going to be up first, and I hope you enjoy the talks that are to come. Pop in your questions in the chat, direct them to me if you can, and now I'm going to mute and hand over to Chris. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kerrie. I would say thank you to Kerrie for moderating for today, and I'd also like to say thank you to Kerrie, who also gave me recently this lighting that I'm using right now, which is a little selfie light that she gave me last week. So I have started by looking at some of the research on how gambling is affected by recessions. So one of the things that, I've been working in this sphere for 13, 14 years now. And one thing that I've heard many, many times is this idea that gambling is recession proof, that somehow, gambling expenditure isn't impacted by economic recessions in the same way that other discretionary spending is. So I wanted to look at a couple of different papers to see if that is really backed up by the data. So the first paper by Horvath and Pat, so they essentially wanted to look at this again from an objective standpoint. Now, again, they start off by saying that yes, there is this anecdotal evidence that gambling is recession-proof. However, they do note that from Vegas, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence coming after the Asian financial crisis, that baccarat revenue in particular plummeted after the Asian financial crisis. Which they sort of attributed to the fact that there were less tourists and travels from the East Asia region traveling to Vegas, where people from those particular cultural groups tend to gravitate towards baccarat as a game. So they look at different theoretical considerations as to how recessions might impact on gambling. So on one hand, they look at this, first of all, so recessions by definition lead to increase in unemployment. So on one hand, they could argue that increasing unemployment leads to less discretionary spending, which in turn would expect a drop in gambling. However, they also note the belief that when people are under financial stress and there's more uncertainty going on, they may increase their gambling either as a way of dealing with that stress or as an attempt to sort of supplement their currently reduced income. Also, when people are experiencing unemployment, they have more spare time, and when they have more spare time, they may be more likely to gamble. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at quite a long time frame and see how these sort of economic growth and gambling sort of co-vary over time. So their data goes from 1959 to 2010, so that's quite a long time frame. And what they sort of found, they sort of broke it down into sort of the three main forms of gambling that are seen in the States, because this is studies that have been done in the United States. And what they found is that, first of all, lottery gambling did seem to be quite recession-proof and even seemed to increase in recessions. However, spending on other form of gambling tend to take a different pattern. So first of all, they saw spending on casino games and EGMs, poker machines in the States, tended to drop during recessions. And they also found a general downward trend in spend on wagering. So in the States, at the time that this data covered, that was mostly regarding horse racing. And they found that, in that time, the horse racing tracks were closing, and there was a general downward trend that sort of seemed to speed up during economic depressions and recessions. So they sort of hypothesized that, there might be something particular about casino gambling that goes down. So as I said, this data was from the States, and in the States, it's not like we have here in New South Wales where there's poker machines in every clubs or pubs. Casinos tend to be sort of destination things. So they're in places like Vegas, Atlantic City, on Indian reserves. They're things that people go to. So it makes sense that during times of economic recessions, when people have less money for leisure spends, they're not booking that holiday to Vegas, they're not going to Atlantic City. So it makes sense that we see that reduction in EGM spends, whereas lottery spends seem to be, quite resistant and even increase in that time of recessions. Now, the other paper by Olesen and colleagues, I hope I'm pronouncing these names right, was based on data that came from Iceland during their recent recession. So Iceland was extremely hard hit by the recent global financial crisis. So they reviewed some of this literature, and as well as that previous study that I mentioned from the States, they also found that studies from other parts of the world also show this same pattern, that lottery spending goes up during recessions, but poker machine spending tends to go down, as well as other forms of gambling. So they wanted to look at specific data from Iceland, and they were very lucky in that they were doing a survey before this recession hit. So they had data from 3,000 individuals before the recession hit, and 4 years later, they were able to follow up roughly 50% of them, so 1,500 people. So I know 50% drop seems like a lot, but considering we're talking about a 4-year time period, being able to follow up 50% of people is actually quite good. And what they found was, one, essentially the same, that most forms of gambling were stable, poker machine spending was down, and lottery in its various forms were up. But they wanted to also specifically look at how problem gambling was changed by the recession. And what they found was, overall, there didn't seem to be much change in problem gambling scores over this different time frame. They did find that people, and given that they did follow up specific people, they were able to look at how specific people's gambling behavior changed. And what they found was, rather than a general move towards people becoming more likely to become problem gamblers during recession, they found the opposite, is that the pattern was generally for more people who were problem gamblers to reduce their spending during the recession rather than the other way around. They also looked at financial distress as a specific indicator. And what they found was, whilst financial distress did predict gambling behavior, that was only true, again, of lottery behaviors. So I guess taking these two papers together, I know there is a lot of, as I said, anecdotal evidence of people when they've lost their jobs or in financial stress, becoming more likely to become problem gamblers. But these two papers on a population level really sort of suggest that on the whole, gambling on non-lottery forms of gambling does seem to actually decrease during times of economic recession. And I guess I'm going to throw over to my colleague, Tom, now to talk about some of the data that we are starting to get at the moment in the current situation. But the general research evidence from recessions is that lottery spending goes up. As we know, lotteries are low risk forms of gambling for problem gambling, but other forms of gambling tend to go down. Okay, and that's it for me.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Kerrie, for hosting us. Yeah, as Chris just mentioned, we've just launched an exciting new research project about 3 weeks ago, where we're tracking a group of Australian gamblers to see how the shutdown, see what impact the shutdown is having on their gambling. And I'd just like to begin by saying thank you. I know many of you on the call this morning have been helping us to get the word out about the survey to recruit participants. So thanks so much for your support. We're really grateful for your help, and we're looking forward to sharing the results with you. On that note, as we're still actually recruiting for the current survey, today will be a bit of a first instalment as we don't have results to share from this study just yet. But I'm going to be speaking briefly now about some of the background to our survey and what we're expecting to see, as well as integrating a few insights from some of the data that has come in that's been published so far on the impact of the shutdown. So the measures put in place by the government to contain the spread of the coronavirus have really created an unprecedented situation in terms of limiting access to gambling in Australia. At the same time, we've seen substantially higher rates of job losses, unemployment and income reduction. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported earlier this week that around 1 in 5 Australians have at least one person in their household who is experiencing COVID-related financial problems. The ABS also found that loneliness has been the most common source of stress for individuals during COVID-19. And as you might have seen in your own practice during the course of the last couple of months, it's likely that these financial and psychological stresses combine and interact with changes in the gambling environment to impact people's gambling patterns. So our survey is trying to understand the impact of the shutdown in the context of people's financial situation. So for example, how it might have impacted their ability to pay for basic necessities like groceries or rent, what sources of credit and loans or other financial assistance like from banks or utility providers that they might have accessed as a result of COVID, as well as changes in the amount of free time that people have and the potential psychological impacts of the crisis that we've been talking about. COVID-19 has impacted all of us in different ways, with some of us affected more severely than others. And so we're interested in understanding the trajectories of different groups based on the different types of stress that they've experienced. So, for example, the study will help us to identify which factors differentiate people who came into the shutdown with a gambling problem and increased their gambling from those who have decreased their gambling during the shutdown. Identifying the key characteristics of the most vulnerable groups will provide important evidence for directing help to where it's most needed. So the data on how gambling patterns have changed since the shutdown is still quite limited, but what we do know is that the government restrictions put in place, effective from the 26th of March, ordered all land-based gambling venues to be closed. So really, the only land-based option that has been left for people has been lottery retailers like newsagents. We know that pre-COVID, despite the rapid growth in online gambling over the past decade or so, most gambling in Australia has still been occurring in land-based venues. In New South Wales, last year's prevalence survey found that only about 1 in 10 adults had gambled online in the past 12 months, which is substantially lower than the number of adults who gamble in general. And in terms of expenditure in Australia, poker machines still make up about half of the $25 billion spent on gambling each year. Since the shutdown, spending on online gambling has fluctuated from week to week, but overall has been up quite substantially, despite online sports betting being affected by the cancellation of so many sporting matches. The latest figures that are being reported by Alpha Beta, an economics consulting firm, show that spending on online gambling was up 114% in the first week of May compared to a normal week. And that's based on transaction data from about 250,000 Australian consumers. However, even with a substantial increase in online gambling, it's highly unlikely that this increase will be enough to offset the drops in gambling on poker machines and other types of land-based gambling activities. So kind of on a population level, we're expecting to see a significant decrease in overall gambling, overall levels of gambling participation as a result of the shutdown. And this would be broadly consistent with what's been reported overseas in the last few weeks. The regulator in the UK last week reported that they'd seen an overall drop in gambling participation there, as well as a survey that was conducted by Nielsen for the health promotion agency in New Zealand. Both these reports suggest that only a relatively small proportion of people have started to gamble for the first time during the shutdown. And the UK research indicates that it's mainly regular gamblers who are trying new gambling products for the first time during the shutdown. So that suggests that we may see some migration from land-based to online as a result of the shutdown, but this is probably going to be limited to a smaller subset of people who are likely to be regular gamblers and potentially motivated to gamble online, maybe because they can't access the place where they would normally gamble. In terms of the effects of the shutdown on how frequently people are gambling and what effect it's had in relation to levels of gambling problems, it's likely that people have been impacted in different ways based on a whole range of different factors. For people who mainly gamble on poker machines, it's possible that the shutdown has acted as a forced break in play, potentially giving them the opportunity to get support and start on their recovery journey. For these individuals, it's going to be really important that they start to put good strategies in place now to prevent problems from occurring again down the track when venues start to reopen. As I know Kerrie mentioned at the beginning, that some people are already thinking about that. For other people though, it's, and it seems especially for people who gambled regularly prior to the shutdown, COVID-19 might have meant that they've increased their gambling. In the UK, while on average people have been gambling at the same rate or less during the shutdown compared to the same time last year, it's among regular gamblers that they've seen increases in the amounts of time and money spent gambling. Increased gambling could be motivated by a number of different factors. Perhaps people are feeling bored and lonely, stuck at home, feeling stressed about all the uncertainty that COVID has brought with it, or maybe wanting to win money to relieve some of the financial pressures that they might be facing during this time. At the same time though, while financial pressures could be a factor to motivate increased gambling, the New Zealand data showed that around half of the people who reported gambling less during the lockdown did so for financial reasons. So for some people, the financial stress they're under might mean that they decide to spend less money on discretionary activities like gambling. So I guess to sum up, this crisis has brought about a kind of natural experiment in relation to access to gambling that will help us to understand more about the extent to which different gambling activities contribute to gambling problems and harm in Australia. It'll also help us to identify the groups who have increased their gambling while experiencing situations of financial hardship and distress. And this is important because it's these individuals who are most likely to experience harms relating to gambling with more than what's affordable for them. So we're really looking forward to being able to share more of the findings from our survey with you. We're expecting to have some preliminary results ready from the first survey around late June. And then the 2 follow-up surveys will be happening in about 3 and 6 months' time. So we should have some more data on that later in the year. But I think Sally's going to continue for us now and help us think more about what the gambling landscape could look like post-COVID.
Thank you, Tom and Chris, for that introduction, and Kerrie for introduction as well. So I'm going to be presenting what I've been reading of what's happening internationally, particularly looking at the industry responses and regulatory responses internationally in some jurisdictions where gambling venues are reopening or thinking about it. So for example, Las Vegas is one prime example where there've been a lot of considerations of how to reopen gambling venues and how to do so in a safe manner. And then I'll switch over to looking at how the implications of that for the Australian environment. So first of all, obviously the priority is on safety, which means social distancing and hygiene and space within a venue. So for something like a slot machine venue, it very much depends on the layout of the venue. There are some venues that have more of a bank style where all the slot machines are really jammed in together. There are other venues in larger, so for example, casinos that have more of a layout where things are separated and more spatial. So it depends on whether the devil's really in the detail of whether it's every second slot machine turned off or whether machines have to be actually physically 2 meters apart. And there's going to be this back and forth tension between then the spatial distancing and hygiene measures and the impact on revenue and attempts to minimize that. So for example, if we have every second machine turned off or machines having to be spaced apart, which means you can't have as many machines, is it all the low denomination machines that are turned off, leaving only the machines that are actually more costly to play in an attempt to try and offset some of that revenue?
Wow.
And if we're looking at table games, it's the idea, there's several different models proposed. Obviously, if you have many people clustered around a casino table, that's not consistent with hygiene and social distancing. So there are several options. One is to wear masks. One is to limit the number of people at a table. So for a table that typically seats 7, you might only allow 3 people. Another is proposed is what's been termed or at least I've been terming the people aquarium, where you actually have perspex dividers. You sort of stick your head in so you can gamble at the table in the safety, not being next to someone or the dealer. And then the final option is fully automated table games, where you have one dealer in the middle of the floor and all the different computerized terminals spread out distancing around that, which will actually increase from one table game offering to 7 people to allowing up to 50 people betting on the same table game. So then you have the questions of things like, if you've only got 3 people sitting at the table, will they be able to actually allowed to play more than one hand, thus increasing the amount that actually can be bet on one table? So this continual back and forth between the revenue, or at least turnover, and social distancing. We're looking at potentially mergers and acquisitions. You know, how many venues actually, is it affordable to stay open and operate if social distancing is in place? And bringing back to the Australian market, are there different areas that are affected? So premium gaming or gambling might be less affected, where there is naturally more space compared to venues that things are closer together. If we think about what's going to happen to venues when they reopen, the examples internationally suggest that there is a pent-up demand. When there have been examples of in the US, casinos opening, there have been lineups outside, you know, queues of people to get in to access the gambling where it's been cut off for them previously. About what happens when online changes. So at the moment, races are still running, and the racing industry certainly still be betting. When sports start to reopen, there's going to be a drove of people trying to bet on the sporting events. Even if you weren't previously an NFL fan, if that's the only game in town, that might attract a lot of betting attention. So there's certainly going to be shifts in what people access and how they access it, with a response from both the regulators and the industry how to offset the amount of money that's been lost during the shutdown. Will there be more of an appetite for trying something new, more innovation, turning into something that is going to provide more revenue and taxation as an attempt to offset some of the losses that have experienced? How are venues going to actually be staffed to enable spatial distancing and hygiene while making it actually afford to stay open and provide the stuff that are needed, and particularly with the increased cleaning that is required? And there's certainly a move to try and get in front of this. So there's already been discussions for the Melbourne Cup being open for people to actually physically attend, obviously not in the same crowded way that's happened previously, but there are discussions about what things are going to look like when they do start to reopen and how that's going to impact the ability, obviously, to gamble. And then, as we've talked about previously, whether people are able to take any gains they might have made in addressing their gambling or getting themselves to a sustainable level, whether they're able to progress that. People that's taken action really taking this time to cement some positive changes in their life, or whether similarly to when someone, is removed from their circumstances, gets in front of their problems and then is reintroduced back into their sort of regular life, whether people pick up bad habits. And especially with this interaction with the economic stimulus has been wound back, people being in potentially worse off financially after the stimulus packages come to an end, how they're going to cope with that, with all these pressures that are going to continue on us. So I think there's a lot of interacting factors that we're going to have to really carefully watch. And I think that we're now in a period, as Tom mentioned, the idea of a natural experiment. We're also in a really interesting opportunity to have a really clean slate in terms of resetting and rethinking some of the measures and policies and practice we have in place. Is this a time to start doing training or setting up a new way to increase responsibility, things that might be disruptive to do while everything's running, opportunities we can actually take now while things are shut down and quiet to reopen in and make a more sustainable and positive gambling environment for people.
Great, thank you, Sally, and to each of our panelists for that really informative discussion. I've got just the one question through, so if anyone has a question on the tip of their tongue, please send it through, but we're going to kick off with this, what I think is a great question. And it's actually been directed towards you, Chris, but if any of the panelists want to jump in, please do. Yep. And it was this idea of, does anyone have an idea about the influence of existentialism or death anxiety on gambling behaviour? And this person has remarked that during this time, there's been a lot of thinking about life and death and legacy and what I might leave behind. And money tends to be a big part of this. And I wonder if, as like things like lottery go up in these times, perhaps compared to other forms, are we looking for life-changing amounts in this time of heightened, mortality salience, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think in terms of the previous research regarding and the conceptualization as to why lotteries have gone up, I'm not sure if it specifically has been tied into mortality salience and what's sort of left behind, but I think it is, that sort of question does touch on one aspect of why lotteries seem to go up. And that's because lotteries are essentially a very low cost form of gambling. Your weekly lottery ticket, might be $5 or $10 as opposed to, even, low levels of spending on poker machines tends to be slightly more than that. So it is a low level cost entry for the potential of, as you say, a life-changing amount of money. So it hasn't been specifically been tied to mortality salience, but definitely part of the reasons why lotteries are thought to have this massive draw in these times is that they do have the potential to change your life much more quickly if you win than if you win the poker machines or the horses. As well as on top of that, they require less time and less sort of research or skill. So if someone has, is in financial strife, they've reduced their hours at work or they've lost their job and they're looking for this hope of changing their life, they may not want to spend hours on poker machines. They may not want to spend hours researching their horse bets and things like that. Whereas the lotteries just give you that chance to sort of, put that small ticket on and have that hope of winning. Now, obviously this previous research is a little bit different. So it does go through different recessions, consistent patterns over time, consistent patterns in different countries. But we should note that this is obviously going to be quite different to what we're seeing now, because at the moment we are having this this rapid shutdown of venues. So possibly that sort of pattern of increased lottery would decrease other forms of gambling might be exacerbated, although from my understanding, horse race gambling has been going up. That's correct, isn't it, Tom?
I'm actually not too sure about horse race gambling. Sally might be able to make a comment on that.
So horse race gambling has increased. Obviously, it's one of the few activities that is still running. There is not as many races as previously, but there are races still running in Australia and internationally. So racing has been one of the beneficiaries of this shutdown. The interesting thing will be of whether that continues once other gambling activities recommence, particularly sports, people are going back to, because, or whether it's something of a learning curve that people have started betting on races and decide that that's really great and then increase their, or continue to bet on that and then continue to bet on sports as well, which might actually result in increase overall in the people's gambling expenditure. Because all of this is really a question of, is it substitution? Is it additive? Is it new customers? That's what we really have to work out. Because a lot of the sort of new accounts that have been opened, they haven't necessarily, it's not natural for someone who plays pokies, for example, to all of a sudden start betting on races and esports. Although, I mean, for some of them, that might be something they gain interest in, but for others, it doesn't, it's not really the same form of gambling.
Yeah, and I think anecdotally, that's definitely what we're seeing with our clients, is that some of our sports clients are reporting some horse gambling, but definitely the poker machine clients really aren't the people that are migrating to horse race gambling. Kerrie, you're sort of nodding. Is that what you've sort of noticed with your clients?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, Chris. We just do not see that trajectory that goes from land-based EGMs, poker machines, to horse racing all of a sudden. That's just not common in my clinical experience. Yeah. Okay. I have another question here, and it's directed to Tom. And just a question around your study. What are you anticipating in finding in the new study, given Australia's unique gambling landscape? Just general predictions, nothing, that is going to tie you down, but is there anything around Australia's gambling landscape that you think may pop out from the survey?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. Thanks for the question. So I think in many ways, the study that we're conducting at the moment is exploratory. We do, as we've been speaking about this morning, we do have some evidence to go on based off previous economic recessions, but then again, the situation that we're in at the moment is different in the way that there's also the changes in access to gambling that have entered into play. So we do have a few hypotheses that we've made about what we're expecting to find in the study. We're expecting to see a significant decrease in overall gambling frequency during the shutdown compared to prior to the shutdown. As I mentioned, most gambling in Australia still happens in venues, both in terms of participation rates and expenditure. And it seems that even if there has been substantial increases in online gambling, that this wouldn't be enough to offset the drops in land-based gambling. We are expecting to see a significant increase in online gambling during the shutdown compared to before. Some people have probably started to gamble online for the first time based on the evidence that we've seen coming out of New Zealand and the UK. But as we've just been talking about, this is obviously not the case for all. It won't be that everyone has shifted to gambling on esports or political events or the weather, all sorts of weird and wonderful things that you can bet on now. It just doesn't happen like that. So it's really interesting to explore some of the more nuanced changes and shifts that occur during this time. And the other main prediction that we have is that the increases in time and in amounts and time, the increases in amounts of time and money that people are spending on gambling will be related to higher levels of psychological distress and problem gambling severity. So that's kind of what we would expect based on the previous literature, that people who are feeling stressed and anxious and have had gambling problems previously are potentially going to increase the amount of time and money that they're spending. It seems that people who were gambling regularly prior to the shutdown are the ones who may have increased their gambling during the shutdown. So yeah, they're kind of the main 3 or 4 predictions that we have for our survey.
I might just follow on that what we're looking at is not also just the shifts in gambling. A lot of that we'll be able to determine after the fact from looking at reports of revenue of just where the expenditure is, but we're looking at the individual factors as Thomas flagged. We have measures in the survey of financial hardship. So we're really trying to understand, are there particular differences between groups? We're looking at problem gambling severity. Are there people who are experiencing harm who are increasing their levels of harm? Is it gambling more common or less common based on people's financial status? So some of the preliminary results from New Zealand, for example, showed that one of the main reasons people said they gambled less was because they had less money. So obviously that's usually a helpful response. If you can't afford to gamble, you should gamble less. But we have to look at that in relation to the context of stimulus payments, which often are directed to people who have the lowest amounts of money. And so people are actually experiencing a financial windfall and potentially more time on their hands because their employment might, or their requirements to look for jobs as per previous Centrelink requirements have reduced. So looking at this interaction of the most vulnerable people, how is their gambling and what's the shift in gambling, and crucially how this is going to change over time. So really one of the key parts of this survey is looking longitudinally what happens 3 months and 6 months or further in the future once venues start to reopen. How is that impacting on people? And maybe Chris can talk about and Kerrie can talk about what advice they have been given clients during this time, including those who might have potentially denial about the change that's happening or their efforts that are needed.
Yeah, and I guess just to sort of, because I just got a question sent directly to me that's essentially links up to that, which is just someone's asked, is there any advice for gambling help counsellors on supporting clients during this time while any forms of gambling might be denied and when non-engagement behaviour is common? And I guess I'd like to hear Kerrie's thoughts on this as well, but I think what we've sort of tried to focus on as well in our clinic and our sort of advice is for all the clients who gamble on, particularly those that gamble on forms of gambling that are shut down, is even if they might not be engaged with the service at this time because they're not feeling the need during this time when their gambling's less active, is one, we do emphasize that, that therapy is a process, and even if you're not able to gamble now, that it is still really important to continue for therapy and to continue sort of exploring the ideas that we were starting with before the shutdown occurred. But on top of that, for some clients, there might be various reasons why they might not be able to come in. So maybe, we've been primarily doing therapy via video link in our clinic. I know other clinics have different setups. So we've just been trying to, if there are people that can't come in for technological reasons, because they don't have sufficient credit to get data on their phone to pay for sort of these sort of sessions. We've just been at least trying to keep touch base with all of our clients. So just sort of having this awareness that yes, things are shut at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it is likely that, the pokies, we know the pokies are coming back at some point, and probably some point in the sort of, I would suggest, medium term rather than long-term future. And so it's really important we just keep touching base with everyone, whether it's once a fortnight, whether it's once a week, for the ones that are a bit more vulnerable, just to keep in touch with them, letting them know that if they have other issues that they are dealing with at the moment, they can come to us, just as a way of sort of keeping that that door open, so that when the venues do reopen and gambling does resume, that we still have that relationship with the client so that we can continue to support them when the gambling goes back to normal, so to speak.
I would absolutely second what Chris has said. I think that my approach has been, as a clinician, to just highlight that it's a really good opportunity to work through some of the issues around gambling and to do the therapy, the program we have at the clinic, because nothing else is likely to get in the way. And sometimes, if there's been a big blowout for a client, and we'll spend time in that space, you know, trying to understand what happens. You know, that can detract from actual, in terms of our treatment, which is quite a structured program, detract from actually getting through the treatment. So I've been trying to just highlight for clients who are a little bit more in denial that this is a really good opportunity to minimize harm to you. And what have you got to lose? Turn up for an hour a week and let's have a chat. But that said, I've still had clients that have stayed in for a bit and then kind of said, oh, I think I'm right. I'll touch base with you in a few weeks or when it's closer to them opening. You know, it's a bit of a juggle, you know, win some, lose some in that regards. Mm.
Yeah, and I've just got another private message from Diane Flack, and what she's pointed out is one of the things that she's been trying to do is to encourage clients to describe how different their life has become without gambling in it, and that's definitely something that I've been trying to do as well. Is just getting clients, you know, especially those that do gamble on poker machines or on sports betting where they're not able to anymore, is really, yes, obviously all of our lives have changed quite a lot since the lockdown. But the fact that you know, the money isn't sort of flowing out in terms of gambling, like what impact has that had? Like what impact has it had on your marriage that you can sit down with your finances and work out what's coming in and what's going in without gambling in the background? What has the impact had on you that when a bill comes in, you don't have to scrounge around for it, that you know what money's sort of coming in and what is it? So that sort of, in some ways, again, you know, Tom mentioned this idea of a natural experiment. In some ways, with the gambling venue shut down, a lot of gamblers are able to see this is what life can look like without gambling. And a lot of people are seeing positive effects of that. And that, yeah, as Diane said, that's been a really powerful thing.
We might do one more question and then I'll throw over to each of the panelists for any closing comments. The question that's been raised has been that one of the panelists noted that lines have been found outside of casinos in anticipation of reopening. And should clinicians be anticipating a gambling binge in problem gamblers? And if so, should we be looking at any precautionary measures like self-exclusion being prioritised in anticipation of this?
I think that's a really good comment. We've discussed this internally at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic about what we expect to see and when we're going to start opening face-to-face and whether we expect to see a glut of clients coming in. And often there is a delay between people starting to gamble again or gambling for the first time, and problems take a while to develop. This will obviously differ between clients. If there are new problems developing or particularly in relation to the stimuluses being withdrawn. So I think the timing of all of these different interactions will play a huge role. I'm similarly in touch with some financial counsellors who haven't seen a glut in clients, which I would have expected. And again, I think that's in the response to the increased action of so many different stakeholders at the moment to provide, you know, rent reductions and deferrals of credit, and, you know, the utilities providers all being quite sensitive to the needs. So I think it's this interaction of when these temporary relief measures start to wind up, how that's going to interact with the increase in gambling venues. But in response to the idea of prevention measures, I think that's a really positive idea. And Tom and I work in the area of financial involvement and what the role of banks or using your bank account to potentially block your gambling. Some of the banks in the UK have the ability for people to place blocks on your account for using it for gambling. And a large proportion of people actually do this who've never gambled before in their life, either as a way of preventing fraud or unauthorized gambling, or also as potentially as sort of a preventative way of just saying, look, I don't ever intend to gamble, and this, I just want to make sure that I never change my mind. So these ideas of placing blocks, using something like a net nanny or a Gamban block specifically on your devices to encourage that idea, and maybe taking out self-exclusion from any of the venues that, you know, are currently closed and clients are thinking about what's going to happen when they reopen. This might be a good time to capitalize on that momentum and change that's occurring and where people want to take these sort of external actions.
Great, thanks, Sally. We're almost coming up to 10:30. Any closing remarks from our panelists? And thank you to all the great questions that have come through. Chris, is there anything you want to start off with?
I just want to say that I think, you know, as I said, I went through some of this previous research for depressions and recessions, but the reality is this is something that's very different from what we've seen before in those economic events. So we really don't really know exactly what's going to happen. You know, I'm sure all of us can come up with different predictions, but you know, as Sally sort of mentioned just before, at the moment, in terms of finances, for a lot of people, there is a lot of government support at the moment. So there is, you know, that increase in unemployment benefits. We have the JobKeeper package. You know, these things aren't designed to last forever. These things are probably only going to be lasting till the spring. So it is likely that some of the things that we're seeing now aren't necessarily going to be the enduring pattern that we see for the rest of this, you know, momentous event in the world's history. So I think we just need to do what we can to sort of support the clients that we have from a clinical perspective, navigate what is going to be a difficult time, and sometimes that might be listening to them, just helping them deal with that sort of uncertainty that they have, and just doing our best to research this and support people that are going through it.
Great. Tom, Sally, anything you want to close with?
Yeah, thanks, Kerrie. Thanks, everyone. It's it's just really great to be able to meet together, even though it's all virtually, but to be able to have this conversation together. A couple of closing thoughts, just to reiterate what Sally said. I think this is a great opportunity to help people think about potentially putting some of those prevention tools or strategies in place. Some of the gambling blocks that are available through the banks, or putting a deposit limit in place, or maybe considering self-exclusion. So talking through those different options with clients. And the other thing, I just wanted to thank you all again for the support that many of you have shown in helping us to recruit participants for the survey. So we're really looking forward to having some more findings to share with you later in the year. Thanks for your interest.
Thanks, Tom.
And I just want to thank everyone again for your attendance. It's been really positive, and I hope that we can host more of these events virtually. I know that we have people really enjoy coming face-to-face to Journal Club, and it is an event that we love hosting face-to-face and be able to have a lot more interaction and engagement. So we're certainly planning on, when we're able to, hosting these events in person, but we're very mindful of the broader audience that we can reach doing a virtual Journal Club. So we might look at, and please do send through some feedback if you'd like to see more virtual events, if this would be a useful way for you to continue to engage. And if you have any ideas for future events, which might include interaction or any other topics or speakers you'd like to hear about. I want to have a huge thank you to particularly Kerrie and Chris for organising this event, and also Tom for being a speaker. Tom, I think, does a great job, a PhD student, but highly capable, and it's a pleasure for us to be able to feature early career researchers. We're very proud of our entire clinic, so we'll try and loop in a few more of our team members who some of you might be familiar with. My only closing comments are to echo what's been said, that we really need to look at the interaction. There's obviously been a reduction in gambling revenue, so there will be attempts to look at that, if not necessarily increase it, but being mindful of that revenue that's not going into tax, into the governments, that's not going into commercial industry. And we are certainly sympathetic to the job losses of the employees in the gambling industry and those people, what they're in hospitality, who are dealing with these various situations, while being mindful obviously of the needs of people in vulnerable situations who are benefiting potentially from this. So it really is a complex area, and certainly I would hope that people looking at policy and reopening are considering safety in its broader sense, to include what the policy implications going forward are for vulnerable populations and responsible gambling, and that we can continue what I think is a really strong trend in Australia and New South Wales, particularly working collaboratively with the various stakeholders to engage and make sure that we can have a positive environment. Please do send through any questions to us directly. If you'd like to follow up on any of the comments, if you'd like to have a chat, we're here and available. Even if we're not in our physical offices, we are all working, and we're really keen to hear any topics you might have for future journal clubs as well.
I might have just a very quick sort of admin sort of talk before we sign off. So first of all, I know with the face-to-face journal clubs that typically we do give out certificates. Unfortunately, due to the nature and the very large numbers we have at the moment, we aren't able to give out certificates for the webinars. So if you do need some sort of evidence, you can keep that sort of registration certificate that you would have got when you signed up. So unfortunately, we're not able to give certificates for this. As Sally sort of intimated, with you know, I know we all, it is a bit different, this journal club, from our normal journal club, because we don't get to see all of you. And I you know, for me personally, I think it's great that we're able to extend it to people that haven't been able to come in the past. But on the other hand, you know, I miss seeing everyone's faces and having that opportunity to participate that we get in the face-to-face journal club. So probably in the future, we probably are going to move to a bit more of a mix between some of them being online and some of them being face-to-face. At present, our next journal club is scheduled for the second Thursday in July. I don't know off the top of my head what that date is. But that one, I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see. Probably we'll let you know sort of mid-June whether that's going to be a face-to-face or an online one. And Sally is also running some webinars as well on various topics related to gambling earlier on Thursday morning, and that's going to be going for a few more weeks now.
Yeah, we have a technology addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre. We've run our third webinar this morning on gaming, gambling convergence. You can catch up on past events and you can register to watch future webinars. Are held at 8:30 every Thursday morning. We've got probably about at least 10 more weeks and the content keeps coming. So we're featuring researchers internationally on a huge range of topics related to technology and gambling. So please do register. You can access that through the Brain and Mind Centre homepage, through the technology addiction team, and there's some really interesting content there as well.
Okay. And if you have any feedback about how the journal club ran today, any comments, any questions, you can email either Kerrie or myself. Yeah, I'll throw it over to Kerrie to finish up.
Yeah, well, just once again, thank you to each of our panelists, and more importantly to everyone who joined the call. I think we had 83 participants, and I'm just seeing on the chat from far and wide, as far as Belgium, you know, as close as down the road. So, you know, this has been really lovely to be able to connect. And it was something that Chris and I had a chat about, saying we really missed Journal Club. We were sad that it wasn't going to take place, and a few emails to some of the counsellors kind of geared Chris on, and I just want to thank Chris again for making it happen. Whilst I'm here moderating, I'm literally a placeholder. All the hard work in the background is done by Chris. So thank you to Chris and to Sally and Tom for joining us and bringing such informative you know, facts to us around what's happening. So that's all from us. It's 10:30, free to go to your next Zoom. Hopefully it's not a next Zoom, but hopefully it's a cuppa. But nice to see everyone, and talk soon. Oh, and thank you to Harrison. I'm sorry, I forgot to say, he's been our IT person in the background. You can't see him, but he's set up the call. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, big thanks to Harrison. And yeah, thanks for sort of putting up with me asking a million questions. And thanks for setting us all up.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.